Hi, and welcome back to Foreign Office. I'm Michael Weiss, your host, and today I'm joined by my good friend Gabrielius Landsbergis. Gabrielius is the former Lithuanian foreign minister and sort of my partner in crime for causing a bit of a scandal or minor controversy in Sweden in August. We were attending an event hosted by the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce, and we were on a panel with the Swedish foreign minister discussing, the elephant in the room, right? The war in Ukraine, the future of Europe, and the transatlantic relationship. And Gabrielis and I were both of the opinion that it was necessary for Europe to begin to draw up some, shall we say, contingency plans for its own sovereignty and its own security that were completely separate and distinct from the Pax Americana, which has obtained for 80 something years. The term that became the buzzword of this conference was decoupling. In other words, Europe should decouple from the United States because under Donald Trump, but actually, even preceding Donald Trump, if you go back into sort of recent history, there has been this kind of pivot away from Atlanticism toward other things, Asia, obviously the Middle East during the global war on terror. But under Trump, I think this process has accelerated, and Gabrielis is speaking very eloquently and perhaps even more provocatively than he intends about this issue. So, Gabrielis, welcome to the show. I couldn't think of a better person to have on in light of the recent, the last 2 weeks of the news cycle. I think has only given a little ballast to our argument that Europe, it's long past time for you to take more responsibility, more ownership for your own fate, because otherwise people like Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Donald Trump are writing that fate for you, and you're only learning about it by reading it in Axios News or the Wall Street Journal. Just to give a little kind of overview of what's happened, this so-called Ukrainian peace plan, said to be authored by the Americans, but really authored by Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, contained 28 points, some of them to do with what Ukraine would be forced to accept under some kind of negotiated settlement with the Russians, but other things much to do with Europe. NATO enlargement, for instance, was, eliminated. So no Ukrainian membership, but no membership for other countries. And also the European Union, which has $300 billion in frozen Russian assets and has its own decision to make about what to do with that money, was being dictated to in this 28-point plan that not only would 50% of these assets be kicked back to the United States, but the EU would have to spend $100 billion of its own money on Ukrainian reconstruction. So, Gabrielis, you're not just a former foreign minister of a European country. You're from a Baltic country, the frontline states, kind of that would fight any conceivable war against Russia in future. What do you make of this? The drift of America sort of into this kind of isolationist, but also weirdly hegemonic state where we don't even check in with our friends and allies, and now the people who are almost exclusively paying the bills to defend and support Ukraine, we just are by the stroke of a pen carving up your continent and your country.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be on your show or podcast or just to have this conversation, which I believe is very timely and important. Indeed, I've been advocating for probably even now for 2 years, even as a minister of foreign affairs. I've raised the question of what would happen that was in 2023, where I asked the question publicly in Lithuania, what would happen if Donald Trump would make good on his promise to leave NATO, because that
Yeah.
was then the topic. That then caused a huge controversy in my country. People saying that it's inconceivable, that can never happen. And but I tried to push for a discussion where the whole continent, the European Union, and especially the countries on the eastern flank, are so much dependent on the security guarantees made by United States that even we're not considering anything that would be, some sort of a plan B, C, or whatever, other options. If, for example, if United States does not leave but has other interests or is entangled in something that is, doesn't allow for United States to participate in defense of the, of Europe.
Yeah.
So naturally, 2 years later, I mean, we're still on the same track. And I think it's important then to really to dig a little bit deeper and figure out the underlying reasons. Because I believe what we're seeing now with the with the way that the United States or the administration this approaches the war against Ukraine is just just elements of a much wider strategy. And it's to put it very bluntly that US can no longer uh, be a guarantor of stability and security on two theaters in Indo-Pacific and in Northern Atlantic. And Obama said it very politely. Trump one was a bit less diplomatic, but still rather, restrained in his, the way that he communicated, basically the same message. And Trump two is basically saying very clearly, I will paraphrase the sentence, but I think it's a bit of extreme importance. Where in February, Secretary of War Defense Hegseth said that Europe can no longer depend on United States for its security. And since then, especially since February, Europeans were trying to read between the lines, right? Look for something that would explain it in some way better. But I think it's a direction. It's an enormous ship of the United States has turned. It's slowly turning away, and now we have to count the time until we are ready to deal with the consequences of this shift of this turn. And um, and many, the biggest issue here is that it's really explainable why this is happening, right? I still am to find an American in where I'm based in California, in Stanford, where I would say, well, in Europe, we just can't, right? We're unable, and people from the right, people from the left and center, they wouldn't understand the argument. Like, what do you mean? You're probably the richest continent there is.
Right.
And what do you mean you cannot do that? So it all makes sense. I mean, we really have to step up and to show the ability to help our allies, such as Ukraine in this context, and ourselves to defend ourselves.
I mean, this is taken quite controversially, not just in Europe, where, people sort of clutch at their pearls and get the vapors when you mention this stuff. Even though I think there is a dawning recognition of the necessity to do this now, because you keep getting shocks to the system. I mean, Donald Trump keeps doing things that, indicate this is as you say, the drift of the United States. But it's also controversial within the United States among elements that are more traditionally Atlanticist in orientation. I mean, there are still internationalist Republicans, for instance, who will tell me, stop talking like this because we're trying to fight this kind of rearguard action against the J.D. Vance, isolationist wing of the party. And when you talk about decoupling and all that, you're just kind of feeding into their sort of shtick. I said, yeah, but if that wing of the party is successful, if you lose the fight as, John McCain-esque internationalists, then Europe is going to be hung out to dry, and Ukraine will lose first and foremost because Europe needs to sustain this war. It's spending all the money. I mean, Donald Trump and MAGA make a big deal out of the fact that the United States is no longer donating weapons to Ukraine. We are selling weapons principally to Europe, but now, I mean, obviously also Canada, now Australia, and countries in the Pacific that are part of this coalition. But this is your war now, and yet seemingly forfeiting the leverage that we would have otherwise diplomatically to negotiate something that we're not paying the bills for. Europe has yet to say, well, wait a minute, like if we're paying, we should be the principal guarantors and the determining factor on the final settlement for this conflict. And that includes territorial concessions, which are still now apparently being discussed, even though, that was a hot button issue when the 28 points came out and it was whittled down to 19 points. NATO membership, which last I checked, concerns more than 24 countries. Yes, the United States is primus inter pares of the alliance, but still it's by consensus that NATO exists, right? And then, of course, the European Union, which, you know, there are things that cannot be done by the United States without, a sort of ratification or secondary approval by the EU, namely lifting sanctions on Russia. Russia doesn't benefit economically if EU sanctions are not lifted. And yet, it doesn't seem like we're checking in or we're coordinating very closely with the European Commission about possible sanctions relief or other things? I mean, what, in your view, I mean, we talk about the collective wealth of Europe, which, I mean, dwarfs the wealth of Russia by orders of magnitude. And in terms of like US trade with Europe, it's in the trillions, whereas even pre-war figures with Russia, between the United States and Russia, that is, we're in the billions. Why, with all this money, is it so hard for Europe to say, okay, we need to rearm at breakneck pace. Let's build, standing armies all across the continent, and let's have a collective security structure in place that isn't reliant on the American nuclear umbrella or American boots on the ground. Like, what is the big issue as a European?
Mhm. I think that there are a couple elements in play. One is that there is a class of European decision makers,
Mhm.
so not just leaders, but basically be part of bureaucracy who just don't take the threat seriously.
Yeah,
Who still do believe, even after 4 years, that it can go away. That, somehow things will be figured out. And even they silently support the efforts by the current US administration, basically just settle, doesn't matter the price. So
hmm,
it's very much this Chamberlainian tactics, right? So if you settle now, things might just calm down
yeah,
somehow, and then, given time, we'll figure things out. So that's one part. The second part is what people, and this probably is more with Eastern European, Eastern Northern European politicians, and again the class of decision makers, where okay, the threat is understood correctly. People do understand where we are, do understand that things need to be changed, but then the enormity of a task is just so overwhelming that we basically don't have a imagination that we could be able to do that on our own.
yeah,
And this is where interesting things happens. And exactly as you say, if a person travels to Washington, a politician travels to Washington, there are two sets of meetings that they would have. One set of meetings is with officials that would repeat the same message. Europe has to do more. US is no longer that much interested in Europe, and just go figure things on your own. And then you meet other sort of people, more of a it's either on the hill or what's still the remains of the deep state, and they would say exactly the things that you are saying, you're referring to. Look, the things are not that bad, right? It's just don't make noise, just stay where you are, stay put, and it will get better. US is not going anywhere. We need you. And I had a number of conversations with Europeans who just returned from the trip to Washington, and they would say, "Well, guys, I mean, the reality is different. Don't read those public messages that this is not truth. America is still there.
right,
America is still with us. They're ready to defend." And I'm like, I do understand that definitely there are people with this, still very deep transatlanticist belief, either because of tradition or because of a sheer understanding that it's better to stick together for any battle that would come in front of us. If US is planning to take on China in Indo-Pacific, it's still better to have Europeans on your side rather
right.
than to do it separately or without Europeans. So there is this understanding, but the question is, are we sure that those people, when the time comes, will have a vote or a significant voice that would shift when it is needed? And we're just not sure. We cannot know. We're
Right.
not participants of that, of either political processes or bureaucratic processes. We just listen, and then it's very difficult to read and to plan because it's Schrodinger's position. It's both things at the same time, right? So
Right.
it's US is still kind of there, but already not any longer.
But there seems like to me there's a logical sort of solution or a way to kind of thread this needle, which is okay, let's plan as if the United States is not there, because certain political actors, including the President of the United States, not an insignificant figure in these calculations, is saying that the United States may not be there. Donald Trump presents NATO as a grift, some kind of freeloading enterprise by Europe where the Americans have to, handle everything and pay all the bills. He has kind of threatened to withdraw from NATO. John Bolton, his former national security advisor, said in term two, this is a guy who will withdraw from NATO. I mean, there's some scary rhetoric going on from the very top. So it makes sense to plan accordingly, to have like in reserve ways of defending yourself and also saying to the United States, if the United States should try to cross Europe in some way or betray Europe, no, thank you. And by the way, you simply cannot do this for
Mhm.
logistical reasons alone. And then, if the United States surprises you and these other elements that you talk about, the deep state or the kind of traditionally minded internationalists win the day, great. I mean, then at least you still have, a
Yeah.
contingency plan, that's in place if, that didn't happen. But it doesn't, everyone seems to be kind of like on a wing and a prayer here. Like, oh, it's not serious. Let's
Yeah.
just keep calm and carry on as before. And yet
Yeah.
you continually are blindsided by this sort of, battering ram policy making that excludes you. And it's not even being done by the US government per se. It's being done by a handful of families, each of which seems to me incredibly compromised and corrupt and doing deals on the side around Europe with Russia and with other autocratic governments in the Middle East and elsewhere, that are just kind of deciding the fate of, hundreds of millions of people
Mm.
on the back of a cocktail napkin at golf resorts in Miami, Florida. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like you guys have come a long way since World War II. It's like the little baby bird that doesn't want to leave the nest. I don't mean to be condescending, but it's sort of like as a pro-European American, I'm encouraging you, go forth, fly on spread your wings here. You have the resources. You can do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's we're talking about the very, very bad scenarios, right? So where there's a contingency, and NATO countries under attack, and United States is just not appearing, right? So kind of then the whole security architecture collapses. Article
Right.
5 is not imposed, and allies do not come, and basically this is the end of European security as we knew it. But there are other scenarios, and some of them are, rather public, which I talked as well about. For example, just recent article in Financial Times, which spoke about the logistics. How many days it would require for the Allies and United States, including, to bring tanks and troops over to Poland or to the Baltic countries, and it said 45 days, right? And I know that General Hodges has participated in some wargaming scenarios in Lithuania, and then he very modestly or conservatively, okay, let's use that word, suggested that it might require at least 2 weeks for a country like Lithuania to withstand the pressures on your own. And I'm saying that alone, I'm not saying that United States will not be there. I'm saying that it might take a while.
Right.
It might take a while. So how do we handle those 2 weeks, 2 months? Who's there? How do we build up the defenses that are required for us to withstand the first blow? And this again a bit connects to my argument that I made in my op-ed in New York Times, where I said that basically if Europe shows that it has the ability to win, quote unquote, basically, so it not necessarily, kind of to beat the Russians, but just push back,
Mm.
withstand. And I have a sense that that could force then the United States government to choose, maybe not because they love NATO so much, not, for different reasons, but they see a country that is resisting. They see a country, a group of countries that are resisting and calling for help. And who knows, maybe pressures from within, just the society will cry out and say, well, we cannot leave those people, alone. So there has to be a response.
Right.
So show that you are able to do that. So now your question is why we're not doing that, or at least, so I've talked about the different threat perception and about the dependence on United States. So that's one thing. I have to admit that things are changing in Europe, and one of the most visible points in this is Germany.
Mm.
Half a trillion of real euros is being put on the table, has been put on the table. and it will be spent. I'm sure that when Germany commits, it's a huge country, rich country, and serious country. When they commit, I'm sure that in 5 years, when the money is spent, Germany will be a different military power than it is today.
Yeah.
Poland is spending, Balts are spending, Nordics are spending. So we are doing, what is required. The biggest problem here is that, and the question that I'm, always raising, do we have those 5 years?
Mm.
That is the thing that I don't find an easy answer to, right? Because if Russians were to knock on our door, let's say in 2030, they will find, German brigade in Lithuania, pre-positioned weapons, pre-positioned ammunition, lots and lots of equipment that Poles have brought, thousands of Korean tanks just, close to Suwalki Gap. And so it's a different environment. But the if is a very big if, right? So it's if they will do that in 2030. But they know that. Russians know that. Putin knows that. He can read, right? So he understands that, our plans are public. So what happens if Russians decide to test us earlier?
Right.
Well, we're not there yet. And American trajectory is not changed. So my argument usually is whether Europe is right in not calling this an emergency, kind of taking things still rather slowly, planning ahead, 5 years, 10 years, so by 2050, wow, I mean, Europe might be a formidable geopolitical power and military power. But what if we need it? What if we need it now?
Right.
And in some cases, I use the example of COVID, right? Imagine if our plans for vaccines would have spanned, 2040. We have time. It's completely okay. Yeah, some businesses are failing, but it's not that bad. We'll figure it out eventually. But it wasn't like that. We called it emergency, and we decided that we need to fix things now, immediately. So we
Right.
borrowed money, created a fund, invested in vaccines, and did everything that was required. And basically, 2 years later, the crisis was averted. With a cost, clearly, because this is usually is required when there is a crisis. But we managed it. We're still not doing this, and this is my probably the biggest worry today.
And I mean, the principal concern about how the Ukraine war will end. I mean, if it's an ignominious end where Ukraine is forced to forfeit territory, bring the Russians deeper into the heart of Europe, and then also gives the Russians time to pause, regenerate their forces, reconstitute all of their inventory, tanks, armored vehicles, and the rest of it. Then we come closer to this kind of 2030 mark where Russia is now even more of a formidable power with more territory in the heart of Europe and all of the population that it will occupy in Ukraine. Those people will be seconded into the Russian military. And Ukraine, of course, is the most battle capable and battle hardened army in all of Europe. So this is giving the Russians, even a greater manpower advantage. And also the tripwire for war, I think we should be very clear, is not necessarily going to be Russian tanks and columns pouring across the border into Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania. It could be these drone swarms that we're seeing of increasing frequency. It could be some kind of provocation, artillery fire, which, kind of either invites or threatens a retaliatory response by a European country, which then triggers a full-scale invasion or something of that kind. And then, as you mentioned, the sheer logistics of getting, American forces and NATO forces to the front line. I mean, it could be a month, and what could happen in a month? I mean, Putin was able to occupy large swaths of Ukraine within the space of just a few days. Um, but I will say, and I think we should talk about this too. It's kind of misleading to refer to Europe because there is no such thing as Europe. There are individual countries bound together by sort of covenants and supranational national organizations. But within the map itself, you see, as you mentioned, the Nordic countries, Poland, the Baltic states. These guys are not only rearming and spending more of their GDP on Ukraine than some NATO countries spend on defense. I mean, Denmark, an ally that we have had for, 80
Yeah.
years, which now we're threatening to go to war with over Greenland. They spend something like 1.9% of their GDP just on Ukraine, which is more than Spain spends on its own defense as a member of NATO, right? the Scandinavian countries, the Baltic countries, these are kind of, they get it. They don't need religion on this subject, right? And that would be, I think, the real coalition we're talking about for defending Ukraine almost indefinitely. Where do you see things headed now, though? I mean, we have this kind of very unstable situation where, again, the US looks to be trying to force an unpleasant, perhaps even miserable peace on Ukraine, using a corruption scandal in Kyiv as its bludgeon or cudgel here. And Donald Trump alluded to the fact just yesterday. I mean, what can Europe do to kind of, and I'm going to be quite frank here, countermand the United States at this point, and to stop some kind of imposed peace that basically just benefits the Russians and releases all kinds of money that Putin will spend not only to enrich his cronies and oligarchs who've suffered greatly since 2022 because of sanctions, but also will be going into this war economy to prepare for the next big conflict. I mean, what should Europe be doing, perhaps at the diplomatic level and the economic level now, in preparation for its rise as a formidable military geopolitical force?
Well, I've always had this idea in my mind that if Europe would make a public and credible commitment to Ukraine's security, not a coalition of the willing type of thing, just where mostly is just a lot of talk, but not real action,
Yeah.
but real credible commitment. Like, where do we see Ukraine in 5 years? Again, going to those 5 years, but starting now.
Hmm.
How much we are going to finance Ukraine, how much of that money is going to Ukraine, because this is probably this starts with the money. This year, Europe has been able to match last year's financial commitment that came from basically two sources, United States and Europe, the main two sources. Now Europe took it upon itself, and now we as Europeans managed to finance that. Um, the main question now is whether we are able to do that next year.
Hmm.
There are, as far as we know from publicly, there are no plans, right? So there hasn't been a budget revision done by France where they would say, fine, next year, our commitment goes to, 12 billion euros, and this is how much we're going to spend on Ukraine. So there is a problem with this. And this is why the question of the frozen Russian assets is such an important one, right? Because if we don't have any other means of financing Ukraine, that is the way to do it. The just money on the table, figure out the program. Many ideas have been flown around. It is possible to do that. It's possible to remove the pressure from Belgians and just go ahead with the thing. The commitment alone, if we agree with Ukraine that until 2030, Ukraine is going to receive the same amount of money that they're receiving now, or even going beyond that, because there's also a question whether, for example, if there are frozen assets being used, so that whether that removes the, Danish, German, Lithuanian commitment.
Hmm.
Are we still spending what we've planned, right? What is, for example, in our case, it's in the budget, or we are going to remove that. If we are going to spend that, so it even goes up. It even goes up. We are able to, to go up from today's budget. So that's number one. The second one is political integration of Ukraine into European. About this, people think about NATO, but that doesn't necessarily need to be just NATO, right? If there's an objection so that Ukraine cannot become part of NATO, and we are unable to overcome it because of a reluctance in Washington or any other capital, we still want to meet the next challenge, the next security challenge in Europe together with Ukrainians, and that would probably be everybody would tell you, Belgians, even Spaniards would tell you that. If you were to ask them, would you like to fight with Ukrainians if Russians attack? Everybody would say yes, of course.
Yeah.
That's a paradox, right? So of course but why I'm speaking, so we cannot just expect Ukrainians to defend us the next time, Russians attack. So that means that it has to be quid pro quo. So we have to start planning of how the future, next 5 years of the European security architecture will look like. And I'm suggesting that to go in parallel with NATO. Europe cannot be the one destroying NATO, right? Or walking away. It's there until United States has this commitment. We trust it. We see that there's a shift. Fine, we can kind of think about it in an intellectual exercise, but it's there. But at the meantime, let's figure out, the parallel structure of integration. So these three elements in combination, basically, they tell Russians that, look, whatever you talk with Americans or with Chinese, I mean, we have our own thing. We're doing what is important, what is vital, what is existential for the continent, what is existential for Eastern Flank, for Poland, for Baltics, for Germany, for other countries in Europe. And we're just going to do that. Here's the money, here's the manpower, here's the political will to do that. And that then, I mean, I'm sorry to sound blunt, but that diminishes then everything that's happening, in all the other tables.
Hmm.
Right. So we're not squeezing ourselves, at somebody else's table, and then saying, well, we're left at the kids' table just this. So just create your own. And we have the ability, right? It's a political decision that we form a plan. Ukrainians agree on this. This is something that they see that is works for them. And again, going back to my previous point, I kind of have a sense if Europeans would show, a strong backbone in this and a set of ideas that would work, I believe that that others would join in. And why not Americans saying, okay, fine, you guys have this plan. It might not be ideally what we wanted, but we respect you taking the lead. We will continue sharing intelligence with Ukrainians because
Right.
that is basically one of the crucial points in the matter.
Hmm. I have two closing questions for you. One, this dispute that seems to be kind of between most of the EU and now Belgium, which is kind of holds the keys to these Russian assets, the frozen Russian assets. There seems to be some suggestion on the part of other European ministers that the Belgians are skimming from the tax money produced by these Russian assets to pay for their own domestic purposes, which is kind of scummy of them, assuming it's true. And then just the general opposition to releasing the assets, which I'm now seeing the Belgian foreign minister telling Politico EU that, oh, well, we don't want to disrupt the Trump-led peace efforts, wink, wink. I mean, what can be done by the Commission to to basically get the Belgians to, lower the drawbridge here and let this 300 billion in frozen assets loose? That's number one. And number two, a little more provocatively than that, there's now a debate, which I didn't expect Europe to ever have, but it's having, about what to do, not in defense to stop these Russian drone attacks and cyber operations and sabotage campaigns using,
Mhm.
GRU recruited assets to blow up cargo planes and shopping malls and IKEA warehouses and, memorials to Soviet occupation and all the rest of it. But maybe it's time for Europe to get on the front foot and start to go on the offensive, hit back at the Russians preemptively using cyber operations, and I'm even hearing, covert action at some level. Talk to me a little bit about both of these two things, and then I'll let you go because I know you had a very long and unpleasant journey from the West Coast to Europe.
Yeah, well, no, it's okay. Look, so first question. There is a bit of a I'll share one, just a tinfoil hat kind of, concept
Hmm.
in this. I just have a question, an open question. Could there have been a conversation between some of the European countries and let's say China, where, China keeps part of its, maybe not the largest part, but part of its money also in euros.
Hmm.
And I'm pretty sure that they are kind of thinking, okay, so what would happen if there was a war, in Indo-Pacific that China starts? And Europeans have this, tendency, not tendency, but, mechanism. So would they have interest for Europe not to do that?
Hmm.
And again, I mean, what would happen if Europe, not Europe, I mean, but some other countries would have said, well, we can promise you that this will not happen. Because one of the arguments that I've heard throughout the years that this debate has been ongoing, it's the stability of euro that could be potentially affected.
Hmm.
And one way how to affect the stability of euro is if some of other big euro holders would start selling the currency. And,
Maybe the
those,
Chinese are engaged in some influence campaign at the EU to
yeah, I
stop
mean,
this.
again, that's why I mentioned, tinfoil hat, because I don't have,
I don't think it's tinfoil hatted. I mean, it seems very logical to me. I mean,
yeah.
there's a lot
I
of
mean,
political
imagine,
pressure.
Saudi Arabia
Hmm.
holding, euros as well, right?
Yeah.
So all these countries, they might be upset if the money, Russian money is being used, right?
Hmm.
So again, it's up to Europe then to decide, how we are placing ourselves, how we are, what is our, game. So the question is also, okay, so if China would start selling euros, what are you going to buy? Rubles, dollars? Both doesn't seem, better options for for China if they're
Hmm.
planning for contingency, right?
Right.
So I mean, so again, it is logical. I'm not sure whether that's an argument, but I mean the reluctance, and the dragging on of the whole debate is really difficult to explain. And I've heard about this that that maybe Belgian government is receiving some funds to their budget because of the assets that they are there. It could be. I imagine that that it is possible to conceive that it is happening. Whether that's the main reason, again, I'm not entirely sure. Kind of,
Mm.
and that this is what leads me to to question: is there a more ominous, some bigger thinking in this that actually forbids us to to go ahead with this? Um, I think that a lot of things have changed when Merz, German Chancellor,
Yeah.
went ahead and said that basically he supports the deal. So that puts a lot of pressure on any country in Europe, right? So it's much more difficult to to get away with this from this. Now it's a question of pressure, and diplomacy. Because if Germany does believe that this is again existential and extremely needed, they have ways how to convince more reluctant allies to to go ahead with this.
Hmm.
So I'm hoping that this will go through. I mean, it feels as if we're very close to the decision. The technical
Yeah.
options are there, so bureaucrats are ready, legal specialists are ready, and we can do that.
Well, just to add to your tinfoil hattedness for a second, my fear is that, the United States is also applying pressure for the EU not to
Yeah.
do this right now, again, because Donald Trump is pursuing his kind of quixotic peace plan, and maybe they're threatening tariffs or other kind of punitive measures if the EU goes forward. Even though Trump has said in the past he wants these assets to be unlocked for
Yeah.
Ukraine's purposes. So you never know. And then to the second question I had about, sort of retaliating first, as it were, against the Russians, and instead of waiting to play defense all the time.
But again, to your point about United States, it's a very important thing to think for Europeans because, for example, if we give in, right, on something that is actually sovereign to,
Yeah.
to a sovereign decision, a European sovereign decision, what happens if United States decides to make a deal on Nord Stream 2
Hmm.
with Russians? And well, then says, well, Europeans, you have to fix your end and start buying. If you're not buying the, gas through Nord Stream 2, we'll again apply pressure on you in some
Right.
form. I mean,
And
these
this was
things
one of the things the Wall Street Journal disclosed at the weekend about these
exactly.
side deals that are being kind of concocted.
Yeah.
I think it was Donald Trump Jr.'s classmate, or no, he's interested in Arctic gas deals. And there was a lobbyist for Donald Trump
Mhm.
who's interested in purchasing Nord Stream 2 and
Yeah.
reactivating
So
it. So, yeah,
I mean, we are in uncharted waters
yeah,
with this, and I mean, we need to plan not for the best scenarios, unfortunately, but be
but for the
prepared for
worst.
something quite different. Now, your next question, other question about the us Europeans fighting back. Um, I mean, there's clearly a way how to do that. We don't have a textbook yet, but I think it's possible to develop that. Basically, what we need to figure out is, what you would be able to call the escalation ladders in the shadow war escalation ladders. So, and what happened until now was that we were kind of caught between two extremes. One is that if there's a jet flying in over, NATO countries' skies, entering its territory, basically like it happened in Estonia, Rutte comes out and says, well, we're so strong that we just basically don't need to do anything because Russians just know that we're just so strong, which is, I don't think that it's, entirely credible. Neither for, Baltic country nor for Russians. Basically, it's kind of a weird way to, to say the situation, to describe the situation. On the other hand, when you start saying, okay, so we need an answer, people will say, well, are you ready to shoot at a Russian pilot? So that's Third World War. This is it, right? So you have two extremes, and but there are options in between that we haven't explored yet, and I suggested kind of just as a thought experiment. So, okay, so you have Estonia, right? And there is a problem with with their air defenses. There's just not enough of it. Are we able to procure to send a Patriot battery to Estonia after an incident to move it closer, and start, and if you put it, I mean, put it anywhere in Estonia, it will cover, a lot of sensitive territory, right?
Right.
Change the way that we engagement logic, so into the something that basically where if Russians enter, NATO either land-based air defenses or air-based air defenses would be able and allowed to lock in.
Hmm.
So it's not, I'm not suggesting that we shoot Russian pilot, the next time they enter, but we show that we have an escalation ladder. We are
Right.
able to control this.
Right.
Because now Russians control the escalation ladder, and they just, so this time jet, next time, five jets, nobody cares because we're just so strong that we're not going to do anything about it.
Well, and Ukraine has its own escalation ladder. As we're talking, I think there are
Yeah.
three different incidents where it looks like Ukrainian sea drones took out, disabled, and are probably now sinking three different ships of the so-called
Yeah.
Russian Shadow Fleet. And they're doing this in the economic zone of Turkish waters, and Turkey is getting a little discombobulated by it. But I remind my audience, I mean, you're talking about shooting down Russian jets. The Turks did this more than
Yeah.
10 years ago in the dispute over Syria. And it wasn't World War III, and Turkey's a
No.
NATO power. It was basically, the Turks and the Russians had to come to an accommodation, and they kind of climbed down the ladder together. So there are these sort of mechanisms in place. But it seems that Ukraine, I have this conversation with Europeans all the time. I mean, you have this, as I say, the most formidable battle-tested army in all of Europe,
Mhm.
intelligence services in the form of the SBU and GUR, which have shown a real willingness to do things deep,
Yeah.
deep behind enemy lines. I mean, Siberia, and then some. They're not in NATO, so they don't have the same kind of, tripwires and
Mhm.
triggers and fear of escalatory whatever that NATO countries have. Um, and I have no doubt that they would be willing to do things on behalf of NATO powers in exchange for goodwill and more weapons and all the rest of it. I mean, there's a plausible deniability factor whilst Ukraine
Yeah.
is engaged in this hot conflict with Russia, right? And I'm probably, I mean, I'm guessing here. I don't have any hard evidence, but I would submit that stuff like that has already happened. We just don't know about it yet. Um, but yeah, it seems to me that, this idea that, well, Europe is fine and sovereign and powerful, and so we can let Russian jets and drones fly all over the place. I mean, these things are now shutting down airports.
Yeah.
Belgium, for instance, which seems, as we said, reluctant to unleash 300 billion in Russian assets. Their airport was hobbled by these drone incidents.
So
Um,
we have the same situation in Lithuania,
yeah,
not with drones, but with a strange vehicle with contraband balloons, with smugglers
right,
balloons,
right,
that are increasing in numbers to extent of basically our airport is inoperational.
right.
Because it's just so close to the border. Belarusians are sending stuff over, and we're unable to to operate our our planes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's I've had a conversation with one expert, and he put it very simply, even, but I like the idea that I said that imagine every time there is an incident where, cable cutting, whatever, drone incursion or something like that in European territory, and we send 50 million euros for Ukrainian drone industry. And every time.
Yep.
And it will accumulate. Okay, so if 50 million is too little, make it 100. Right? So I mean, Europe has that power to do those things, right? So it's a
It's like parents with the swear jar when their kids say a bad
exactly,
word,
yeah,
you put a dollar in the
exactly.
swear jar. The Russians have to
Yeah.
put, yeah,
Yeah. So we're not pointing fingers at what to attack, where to attack, but basically
right,
fine. Ukraine is defending us. So you wanna play this well, fine. We have the resources to
right,
outlast you, times over.
yeah. Okay, well, again, we find ourselves in violent agreement about many things, Gabrielis.
Thank
I
you.
know you've had as I said, a long journey, and you want to get some rest. I thank you for joining me here, and yeah, so you've written an op-ed in the New York Times, which came out, what, 2 weeks ago? Which I
Yeah,
want to
some 2 weeks
direct.
ago.
Okay, so I'll put a link in the when this goes up to your op-ed, and if there's anything else, you also have a Substack as well, which I recommend everyone to read. Your essays are always very incisive and well timed. So thank you. Yeah, and I hope we have you back soon.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure.
Okay. You've been listening to Foreign Office. I'm Michael Weiss. My guest today was Gabrielius Landsbergis. He's the former Lithuanian foreign minister, and now are you a resident at the Hoover Institution or Stanford, is it? Or I forget.
I'm visiting fellow at the FSI, the Freeman Spalding Institute, and Hoover as well, at both.
There you go. Okay. We're all good Cold Warriors end up at the Hoover Institution. All right. Thanks very much.